All right, cool.
we were
It's
originally
real.
slated. We were originally slated to go live at 2:30, but we upped it because why not? Hey, it's an off day anyway. It's a 3-day weekend, so we can kind of get a little loosey goosey with the rules, folks. And anyway, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Mike to New Haven podcast. This is episode 140. If you haven't checked out the previous episode, that was the continuation of one of the three miniseries we have within this show. It's called Tales from the Boom Room: Profiles of the NYPD's Arson, Explosion, and Bomb Squad. Detectives Paul Yurku, Richie Teamsma, and Don Sadawi from the Bomb Squad joined me as we did a deep dive back on a case 25 years ago, turned 25 years old last week, letter bombs to the United Nations in January of 1997. Good show with three really terrific guys from the Bomb Squad. So we're continuing with the NYPD theme with my next guest, who spent 20 years on the nose serving the people of the city of New York as an officer and later lieutenant in the NYPD. He joined the force originally, I believe, as a housing cop, as we'll discuss, in 1991, rose up the ranks pretty quickly, got to lieutenant in just 12 years on the job. He retired in 2011, and he's staying active, frequently appearing on television. You can catch him on just about any network, offering his opinions on all things policing, and that is the one and only Darrin Porcher, Dr. Darrin Porcher, who joins me now on the Mike to New Haven podcast. Doc, welcome. How are you?
Boom! Finger pistols. Yeah, I'm here. I'm glad that I'm in the building. But you know what, Mike? I'm just a little disappointed in you. I think that I was hoping that you would have been dressed appropriately for this significant interview. Damn, man. Look. This is a legitimate business, and if you can't come dressed, then there's no need for you to do the show. It took me 2 hours to get dressed for this thing.
Duly
You
noted.
just brushed in there. Yeah, okay. But in any event, I'll accept your lackluster dress code, and it was supposed to be business attire, and I guess you chose to do something else, but that's neither here nor there. But
yeah, it's casual Monday around here. So you'll have to dock me 5 points for that.
Yeah, okay. But Mike, not for nothing, only you can pull that shirt off. I can never win with that shirt. If I put that shirt on, oh man, forget about it, please. I'd get it from all corners.
Well, yeah, I think you're giving me too much credit there, but I do appreciate it. So we'll get right into it. The first question is an easy one. Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in the Bronx, and BX all the way, and that's kind of what it was. Yeah, for the most part. Okay, you from the Bronx, Mike?
I got family down there, so I'm a Bronxite by association. My family's over in East Tremont.
Did you ever wear that shirt when you visited your family in East Tremont?
No, I did not. Admittedly.
Okay. All right, cool. Yeah, I'm from the Bronx. Mike, understand. I know that you're doing your show, and this is your show, but you also moonlight on Police Off the Cuff. So I'm just so happy to make your acquaintance on your show, and I just get the level of autonomy that I can just kind of stretch all the way out, and I'm happy to be here. But I grew up in the Bronx, cop in the Bronx. Did a lot of things in the Bronx, to say the least. But then, I went on active duty in the military, went to different corners of the globe and worked, simultaneously. Started off on active duty, then I worked at the United Nations, and then I became a cop in the NYPD. Started out in the South Bronx, and then progressively worked in other areas of the department. And you mentioned that I was a lieutenant I made lieutenant in 12. I actually made lieutenant in 9 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was a lieutenant for 11 years.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, dock me another 5 points for that first award.
Nah, that's cool.
I
was running things for 11 years.
As we'll discuss. So, you got into originally, I believe it was the New York City Housing Authority Police in 1991. That's where you first started?
Yeah, it started off, I was mopping floors, and they were short a shift one day, and they said, hey, look, can you fill in? Here's a gun badge and ID. I jumped in, and I never looked back.
So it was originally PSA 7, as you said, over in the South Bronx.
Holding it down.
Yep. Exactly. Holding it down over there in PSA 7.
Lay down or lay down. Don't let it be you.
So for those that may not know the makeup of the Bronx, what does PSA 7 encompass?
Well, at the time, it was you had 3 different autonomous police agencies in the city of New York. You had the housing police, you had the transit police, and the city police, but they all fell under the umbrella of the mayor of the city of New York. And at the time, it was, when I first became a cop, David Dinkins was the mayor. And then when Giuliani came in, he realized that it just didn't make sense because there was an overwhelming level of duplicity in the 3 different departments. You had 3 different medical service units, 3 different of everything. And then they basically cut that down. And it was more of a cost-effective move to combine all 3 departments, because all 3 departments, you had sworn police officers, and they had the powers to effect an arrest anywhere in the city. And they were going to the same central booking. So it was like, look, why not combine it? Because I went through the same police academy as the transit, and the city police officers. We all sat next to one another. And then upon graduation, that's when you were deployed to whatever department that employed you. That being said, it just didn't make sense to have the 3 departments, and that's why we have it the way it is now.
And it makes sense, as I've discussed before, why they merged it in 95. It was a good move in hindsight. And the thing that I always go back to is it allowed for career advancement. I kind of talked about it. There's a funny story involving that. Jeff Oberdeer is a friend of mine, and maybe you crossed paths with him. I don't know. But
Jeff and I worked together. Jeff was in the bomb squad.
Yeah, yes. Jeff, exactly. So he came
Jeff
on.
Was 6 months ahead of me. He came on in April of 90.
Right, and he was EOD in the I think in the Air Force.
In the Air Force, yes.
Right, so he came on as part of my Bomb Squad miniseries that I alluded to at the top, and he was saying that when he graduated, his wife was also on the job. Some of the guys that he went back to were crying because he's originally from Ohio, so he didn't know how the makeup of New York was at the time in terms of the agencies. And he's like, "Why are you guys crying? We're going to be cops. Who cares? We're going to go out there and do the work." So, that said, for you, before we get to the merger itself and your career advancement, what did you most enjoy in hindsight, pre-merger, of being a housing cop?
What did I, prior to pre-merger as being a housing cop?
Mm-hmm.
Housing was more dangerous because you worked in the socioeconomically impoverished neighborhoods, that being housing developments. And, I'm not taking a shot at the residents of public housing, but it seemed as if it didn't seem, when you look at the quantitative statistics, you had a far greater propensity for danger working in the housing developments than you did working in transit or the city police precincts. And so I think it really, I drew a level of understanding of how to manage situations when I was by myself, such as being in an elevator, in a stairwell, and you run into people that are doing things or, committing to nefarious activities. You say to yourself, damn, what, by myself, how am I going to handle this? So, you oftentimes develop what we refer to as a tactical pause, meaning sometimes you may want to just take a step out of the situation, request additional assistance, resource in the form of more officers, or try to talk your way through it as best as possible. Because, it's not like being on the 24th floor of a housing development building and the elevators are not working. And then you're requesting something referred to as either a 1085, meaning an officer needs assistance, or a 1013, once again, officer needs assistance. And then you're on the 24th floor and the elevators don't work. Your chances of the people getting to you at full strength are marginalized based on that particular narrative. So I learned how to work by myself and how to manage situations as best as possible, be it through a discourse between individuals or de-escalation. Oftentimes there's things that you may want to do a certain thing in terms of taking a person into custody, but de-escalation, I found in many ways worked to my advantage. And so that's using the best weapon that you had on the street, which was your mind and not your pistol. So that was one thing. The camaraderie was much stronger when I was in housing than when we had the merger and we all fell under the auspices of the NYPD. I felt that once we merged with the NYPD, there were different silos of people, cliques, if you want to call it that. Whereas the bond of brotherhood was not as great in the NYPD as it was in housing because we have far less members. And so, those are 2 things that I felt were significant components that enabled me to do different things when I came. I should say different things, but from a level of self-betterment when I became a cop, or I should say when I merged into the NYPD and did the things that I did over there.
Dr. Darrin Porcher is our guest here in the Mike to New Haven podcast. We're certainly happy to have him. More with Darrin in just a second. But first, acknowledgments as always to the viewers in the live chat. And if you want to ask Darrin a question or me a question, fire away in the chat. I'll make sure that we see it. Margaret Hearn, always here, always a great supporter of the show. Thank you very much. She's listening in from New York City, so she's very cold today like I am in New Haven, Connecticut. So hope you're staying warm, Margaret. Ruth Ann Griffin, thank you. The Truth, and my sister, as always, another very loyal supporter of the show. She's watching. Thank you, John, for being here. I hope that you're staying warm too. So that being said, the merge happens, and a lot of guys, like you kind of spoke about, like Jeff spoke about when he was on the show. Yeah, it's great because now there's room to advance your career. It's a little different, as you alluded to, in the fact that there's not the strongest of camaraderie because it's a larger department. But now, if I want to go, like Jeff wanted to go to the bomb squad, he can. Now, let's say you wanted to go to, not that you did, I want to be in hostage negotiation. You can, because now the avenues have opened. That being said, some guys, like, our friend Scott Wagner, he calls it a hostile takeover. Looking back, I know you said it made sense to merge.
I know Scott.
Yeah.
Scott was a detective in housing.
Yeah, and Scott to this day doesn't like the fact that they merged the 3 departments, and he loved original housing, and I don't blame him. So looking back at it, there was positives to it. Yeah, there's negatives, as you kind of highlighted, with the lack of camaraderie. But as you would, if you have to judge it, when you look at the way the housing sector of the police department, the NYPD that is, does things now, what are some of the pros and cons besides what we've already discussed about the merger almost 30 years later?
I think upward mobility was more difficult in the NYPD than it was in housing. I think that housing, when you look at it per capita, they promoted more people in housing to the civil service ranks of sergeant, lieutenant, and captain. Whereas in the NYPD, it was more of a glacial process. It didn't move as quick. In terms of career advancement, that's a double-edged sword, because one may say, hey, look, as you made mention of Jeff, for example, Jeff went to the bomb squad, but I genuinely believe that Jeff Overdeer would have been able to get to the bomb squad even if we were still housing, because a lot of the units within the NYPD accepted members of transit and housing. Case in point, at the years a couple of years ago, we had the Organized Crime Control Bureau, OCCB, and that's when you had people in narcotics, public morals, vice. Meaning, when I say public morals and vice, they locked people up for policy, meaning illegal numbers, prostitution, things to that effect, or these unlawful nightclubs. You had people that were from housing and people from transit that were working in those units. Now, you did have some specialized units where the NYPD worked autonomous, but the stuff that, all right, highway, for example, you didn't have a housing cop working in highway, nor would you have a transit cop working in highway. But you had a lot of significant opportunities. You had the DEA task force that you can go to when you worked in housing. But what I was getting at was you had a larger pool to compete against when we became members of the NYPD. So although you may look at the grass being greener, it still became much more difficult to get to those assignments that were preferred because of nepotism or just people that were in position to get those jobs. And you're coming from housing. It's like, look, man, you're at the bottom of the line, kid. Wait your turn. I mean, I was an instructor in a police academy as a sergeant, but that was something that I would have been able to obtain if we were housing only, because we had housing officers that were instructors in a police academy. So, it's somewhat of a double-edged sword. And I think it's not just with the NYPD, but I think it's anywhere you go. Case in point, I was an officer in the Army, and, we had different, I was an executive officer. There were a contingent of different responsibilities that I had while I was in the Army. And it went back to, look, you know what? It's really dependent upon what's your skill set and how you effectively advance your skill set to get to the place that of your choosing. Your greatest competition is what you see in the mirror. You're always in competition with yourself, not in competition with the surrounding population of practitioners within the department that you're working in, such as the police department. And when you look at yourself as your greatest level of competition, I think that's when you will be able to hurdle or overtake any obstacles that come in front of you to get to what you're looking for.
And I think that that's very well put. I do want to ask, before we pivot off of the subject of housing, did you work with John Coughlin at all?
John who?
John
Coughlin in ESU?
Mm-hmm. He was a housing cop originally, too.
No, unfortunately, it was like we were ships that we passed like ships in the night, and we just never had the ability to work together. But I know who he is. Unfortunate. He passed away during 9/11. During the terrorist attacks down at the World Trade Center, saving people that he'd never met before in his life. We had a lot of officers. I know several people, two people that I worked with that lost their lives going into the towers in relation to saving people that they never met, just based on them believing that this was the right thing to do.
For those of you that don't know, as he said, John Coughlin was a sergeant with the NYPD's emergency service unit. He used to be in the housing police's rescue unit. It wasn't called emergency service, it was rescue. But they had all the same equipment on their trucks that ESU would have, minus maybe some of the automatic weapons that ESU has. And John died in the collapse of the South Tower that tragic day. So you made detective around the mid-90s, 1995, and you were working in the Internal Affairs Bureau. Now, we see it portrayed, anybody that's watched an episode of Law & Order, anybody that's heard some of the cops talk, they're not exactly fond of internal affairs for a myriad of reasons. I've heard the joke thrown around before, it's called the rat squad. But you need it because you don't want anybody that's bending the rules, or even worse yet, breaking the rules, to be allowed to continue within the police department. So when you look at cops that kind of throw their nose up at IAB, how difficult was that for you, if at all, battling against that sentiment? And what would you say, I guess, for lack of a better way to word the question, in defense of IAB?
Well, just going back to when I was a detective, I worked in an investigative unit that was labeled as the Internal Affairs Bureau, but I was actually doing some other things, because what happened was I was an undercover, and I was really far off the grid doing the assignment that I was doing. So what I was doing didn't really involve police corruption, so to speak. It was something, even to this day, I look back at this stuff and I'm like, wow, man, I can't believe that that's what I did. But I did go into the Internal Affairs Bureau as a lieutenant. And when I went there as a lieutenant, I got the chance to manage and supervise these corruption investigations, as you may mention to. And, it being referred to as the rat squad. I mean, you had people that had that sentiment. And, the best way to describe it is in anything, I shouldn't say anything, with most large scale organizations, you have an internal quality control faction that's driven towards ensuring that the machine is running accordingly. People are not placing sand in their gear, so to speak. So when you look at officers committing to acts of corruption, I mean, I had a team of sergeants, police officers, and detectives that investigated these allegations of police corruption as to who was doing what, how they were doing, etc. And I felt that it was, it was interesting work, man, because one of the first things that I said when I got there was like, I would look at these folders or these case folders, and I would say, this is BS. And I wouldn't use the initials BS. I would say something else, but to keep it clean, I'll use those initials BS. And I just give you one quick example. I had an officer. I should say, my team gets there's a captain in the office, and we get this allegation of a detective on duty molesting kids that are like 12, 13 years old. And the detective was married. He had a wife, 2 kids. And so the first thing I said, this is BS, right? And my captain said, just take a closer look at this. I'm telling you, Cap, this is BS. And so in any event, the detective was working out in Brooklyn North in the anti-crime unit, and he was meeting kids online, and he had one of these webcams. They would communicate that way. And the detective actually, while he was at work, left Brooklyn North. So I'm going to give you, the best way to give you an understanding as to where Brooklyn North is for someone that's of a lay population that just happens to be watching this. Think in terms of maybe downtown Brooklyn. He left downtown Brooklyn while he was at work and went to Westchester County with the intent on meeting with this kid. And it was like, man, hold on one second. Just forgive me here. Can you still see me?
Yes.
Okay, I apologize. I don't know why I can't see you anymore. But in any event, okay, here we go. So in any event, can you still see me?
Yes.
Okay, I apologize.
I
don't know what the hell happened here. So, but in any event, this detective, he meets with these, he's meeting with someone he thinks is an actual child, but they were investigators in the Westchester County District Attorney's Office. And what they did was we set a sting up, basically. They had the detective meet him, meet the person that he believed was an undercover, and then once he gets there, it's something completely different. And that being said, I was like, oh wow, this is not BS. This is really happening. And it got me to say to myself, damn, man, I guess there's a reason for having this internal affairs bureau. So, from that point on, and that happened early in the game when I was there. So from that point on, I started to say to myself, look, you know what? It's something that we do need, that internal mechanism to ensure that things are being done right. Because if we don't have an internal mechanism in policing, we'll have something that's reflective of places like Mexico. When you look at how the drug cartels have overrun law enforcement in the country of Mexico, it was based on corruption that was ongoing for years on end. And you didn't have a quintessential law enforcement faction in play in Mexico. And this is what you see that came to fruition. So I felt that it was necessary. Not just I felt, I mean, people way before me felt that it was necessary to have this internal monitoring process, that being the Internal Affairs Bureau. And it was something that, like I said, when I was a police officer, when I was a sergeant, when I was a detective, I always looked at Internal Affairs bureaus like, these are the rats. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. But in the grand scheme of things, it works, and it preserves the 8.5 million residents that live in the city of New York, to ensure that they receive quintessential policing to the best of the ability of the city of New York. So I now, as I look back at it, I think that this is the way to go.
I think so too. I think it's a unit that's very underrated in what it does. And I think now more than ever, it plays a very important role, not just to find those who are doing the wrong thing, but even vindicate those who may have been accused, but as it turns out, are not doing the wrong thing, are doing everything exactly the way they're supposed to do. But it ensures a fair process so that we don't jump to conclusions either pro or anti one cop in any case, one way or the other, when these incidents do unfold, either allegedly or, as a matter of fact, through the investigation, proving that it indeed took place, as we just discussed with a case involving that detective who violated his oath, to say the least. So you mentioned earlier when we were discussing things that you were an instructor at the police academy. It's an important place to be as well, because you're training the next generation, and what you tell them, they carry 20, 25 years down the line. And then along the way, they're passing it along to their junior members that they see in the precinct, or maybe they're even instructing at the police academy someday. I've had many guys from both the FDNY and the NYPD who still recall what they were told in the academy, good or bad. So for you, what were you looking to tell these guys and gals to make sure that they took it with them, and maybe even still have it with them all these years later, and what we hope are successful and proud careers?
One of the things that I would always mention to recruits was, you're not just doing this for yourself or a paycheck. Remember, you have people that are within that organization that you're supporting in terms of keeping them safe as well. Case in point, and if an officer is requesting assistance, you will be a person that will assist that officer. But in addition to that, by you doing what you're doing, you're also protecting the citizens in the municipality that you're employed by. You have relatives, you have friends, and those people deserve to be protected under the umbrella of law enforcement. And so, in addition to that, like, as a new officer, you want to do as much as you can because you're full of piss and vinegar. You want to jump out there, you want to arrest all of the bad guys, and I get that. But a lot of police work is I want to say 90% of police work is boring, man. The gross majority of what you do is service related, such as answering a call for a lost child, a noise dispute, things or lost property. A lot of this stuff is not involving chasing bad guys. So just be prepared that this is what you're going to face. I mean, you have some units that are more hyper focused on enforcement, such as narcotics or emergency service, but that's not what the average patrol officer is doing. So when you become a member of the NYPD or any police department for that matter, your focus should be service oriented and doing the best that you can to support that population that ultimately pays your salary. But remember, as an instructor, to hang in on every word. So you are the face of the NYPD when you're in that classroom as an instructor. So you need to conduct yourself accordingly. Granted, I was a supervisor when I was an instructor, but it was always in the back of my mind that I'm the face of this organization, and what I do will reflect either positively or negatively on this recruit officer when, upon graduation, they serve the citizens of the city of New York. Therefore, it's necessary for me to do the best that I can to ensure that we have a quality, finalized product, in that being the recruit that graduates from the academy.
You emerge a different person from the academy than as you enter. You come out with really it's a beautiful thing to watch. The entire class in both the FDNY academies and the NYPD academies, they have their own individual personalities when they come in. But at the end of it, you see, and it's a molding process, as you just alluded to. They're one collective team with one collective mindset. And it works because that final product is the one that goes out there and gets the guns off the streets. They answer the service calls with empathy. When the action ramps up and it is time to do some of that police work we see dramatized in movies and TV shows, they're able to do it. Maybe not the way it's done on TV, but nonetheless, they're able to get it done. So it's a very important thing. And I love what you said about leading by example, because it does reflect. Some people forget that in any job, not just law enforcement, as they go along, and they kind of begin to slack. To which somebody who's more more of a junior might look at that and say, well, you know what, if he can do it, what do I have to give 110% on my end, which is not the way to go. I do want to ask you about this, and if you can't discuss it, then don't, because I don't want to get you in any kind of trouble. But you mentioned this earlier, and I shouldn't gloss over it, about being undercover initially in the mid 90s, doing something in internal affairs, but not really a part of the internal affairs bureau per se. If you can discuss that assignment,
No, I can go into it.
Yeah, what can you tell us about your time undercover?
All right, what I did as an undercover officer, I had, and you have different factions of the police department where you have undercovers that do different types of undercover work. I had I had a driver's license that was authentic. I mean, it actually came from DMV with a fictitious identification. I was working on something that was, it was very, how can I put this to you? I was working on a very sensitive issue. So in no way, shape, or form could any of my identification be attached to the New York City Police Department. That's why everything ran under the umbrella of the Internal Affairs Bureau when I was a detective. So if anyone was to ever look at it, they would just see, okay, this is a person that works in internal affairs, and that was that. But there's a lot of people that were doing the stuff that I was doing that were a part of this unit. And a lot of times, like, you have, whether it's political corruption, and I'm not saying that what I was working on was an aspect of political corruption, but when you have ultra sensitive issues, you need to be really careful on how you bridge the investigation into that individual, because there's a lot of eyes on this stuff, and you don't want the wrong person to see it. But at the same token, the acts that the person that you're investigating is committing are so detrimental to our city. It's necessary that we have the appropriate component of investigation to address it. And so, like, all right, I'll just give you one scenario of of one of the things that we have working. We had set up an ice cream shop in a particular, that we had an ice cream shop. We're literally speaking, we're selling ice cream in this place. So the city of New York has sponsored this ice cream stand. So you got people that are coming in, they're buying ice cream, and the people that are working in this particular place are New York City police officers. The focus was criminal activity that was occurring at this particular location. So you had a component, you had a criminal enterprise that was working at a particular location. It was just really tough to insert an undercover there. So all of the money, all of the proceeds from that ice cream stand went back to the city of New York. So it wasn't like we kept the money, but it worked well, because when I tell you the lane of information that you received based on the location of that ice cream shop, we could have never gotten that by just placing undercovers there intermittently. We had officers working 16 hours at this particular place. And so the people that were engaged in the criminality were comfortable looking at looking at this ice cream shop as, oh, this is just an ice cream shop. They conducted criminal business in the ice cream shop periodically. They'd come into this ice cream shop and they would exchange money, even like, look, do me a favor. I'm giving you $100. I got this from a transaction that I conducted, but they were worried about the police having marked money. So who were they giving the money to? And we would exchange it. It was the police. But there was a much larger fish on the horizon that we were focused on. So like the low level drug dealing, that stuff was, what we did was we afforded the investigative entity that was responsible for such as narcotics that information as a look, this is what happened. This is what you need to look out for. But I was there for, in that unit, I didn't work in an ice cream shop for that long, but I want to say I was there for just under 4 years. We did some amazing things there. And that was a very rewarding component of my career in the NYPD. I made sergeant from that particular unit, and I just had such an amazing level of investigative skill coming out of there that there was no investigation that I was uncomfortable seeing, with the exception of financial investigations, of course, because, generally speaking, when you have people that have an accounting background, they're far better at those financial investigations. But my stuff was together working there. But, now I work as I work as a criminal justice expert, and oftentimes I investigate these cases. You have attorneys that will hire me for different cases. Just recently, the city of Chicago, or the Chicago Police Department, hired me as an expert in connection with a gang-related homicide that they had up there with the Gangster Disciples. That's the name of the gang. Yeah, the GDs up in Chicago. So I actually represented the city of Chicago and the Chicago Police Department in connection with this GD investigation. We just wrapped it up just recently. Actually, last week it wrapped up. But that's what I do now. I work as an expert, and I testify in trials all over the country. And the one thing that I really lend deference to was the investigative skill that I picked up while I was working that assignment for that 3.5 to 4 years. And it just, I want to say, the amount of knowledge that I gained from that was limitless and priceless. And it's carried me 30 years later in what I'm doing today.
Was the ice cream good at least?
It was, yeah, let me tell you, it was average stuff, man. Like, when I tell you it was average, I mean, I ate ice cream, and, it's funny now that I think about it, like, we had ice cream in there. We purchased the ice cream from, I guess it was like a wholesaler. So we had a tax ID. We had a tax ID, so we were able to purchase this. I mean, that's how deep this thing went, man. And so we sold ice cream. We made shakes. Initially, it just started off just doing regular ice cream cones, and then it evolved into making like shakes, banana splits, a bunch of other things. And it was like, that was never the plan. But you know what? I'll tell you, man, it ultimately got us to the point where we were able to do what the objective was. And like I said, that was like, I had no idea the police department had units that did things like that. I know there were some units years ago, you had an intel unit that did some similar things, but not to the magnitude of what we did on that particular case. Not only did I was working with members of the NYPD, members of the district attorney's office. We had some federal, members of ATF and the FBI. So it was a joint operation that we were working. And all of those people that came from the other outside agencies were in the same position as I was. They were not a part of that department. So I guess when you say a member of the NYPD assigned to the Internal Affairs Bureau, it would seem as if I was a part of the department, but they were in very similar situations. We all had fictitious IDs, and we did what we did. And, to this day, we still maintain close contact. There was a brotherhood that existed amongst all of us that were working that particular case. 3.5, 4 years is a long time.
Of course. I imagine how devastated the innocent civilians were in that area when that shop shut down. You're going there for your banana split, and then you find out it was a police operation. Damn it, But I'll ask you, making sergeant, making lieutenant, and this is a two-pronged question specifically for your time as a lieutenant. A lot of people have told me that lieutenant within the police department is the best rank. Why is that?
I've heard that. I disagree. I think one-star chief is the best rank in the department because, generally speaking, when you're a one-star chief, in many instances, you're not the commanding officer, but you are like either an executive officer or you're in a position that allows you a lot of free moving space, so to speak. Lieutenant was all right. I just think maybe years ago that was fine, but with the inception of ComStat, you had lieutenants that were responsible for presenting to the command staff in the NYPD at 1PP, one police plaza, in connection with what are the crime trends, what's being done. So the lieutenant's responsibilities grew, and he or she no longer had the flexibility to do what they wanted to do because the level of accountability increased. So that's why I say lieutenant is not as good as it was years ago, especially now. One-star chief, or even a deputy inspector that's not a precinct. No, I should say a full inspector that's not a precinct commander. So full inspector or one-star chief, I think those are the best jobs when you're not the commander of a particular establishment.
You mentioned your time in the military. You spent 21 years, I believe, in the military from 1988 until 2009, if I'm correct.
Well, no, it was a little longer than that. I went in '86. Ronald Reagan was the president when I went in, so that I guess that's a reflection of my age, right? People,
No.
I don't even know who the hell Ronald Reagan was. Okay.
But that being said, a lot of guys that go into civil service, the people in the academy that are instructing them, or the gals too, they love that because it provides them with they have a great template already because there's a lot of discipline in the military. Then you parlay that into a career in either the police force or the fire service. And they call that kind of cop or firefighter a squared away individual. So for you, how do you feel that background in the military personally helped you in your career as a police officer?
I think my background in the police department, I should say my background in the military was tremendous in instilling a level of discipline and a can-do attitude. I want to get this thing done. That was, I want to say that was probably the foundational principle of what allowed me to get things done the way I got them done while I was in the department. And you have gross similarities. Police departments are paramilitary organizations, and so by being I apologize.
It's fine.
I'm playing with this camera here. I'm sorry. This is actually a new MacBook Pro that this is the first time I'm using it, to be honest with you. But it's a paramilitary organization, so a lot of the benchmarks in police departments are connected to what happens in the military. So, the discipline piece was important. Just keeping yourself, as you mentioned, being squared away is important. Just like you want to pay attention to your uniform, how you present yourself. And whenever you prepare any reports, you want this to be a reflection of you as a person being an outstanding individual as a part of the organization. All that stuff comes into play. And I think that, I think anyone that becomes a member of a police department should start out in the military first and then progress to becoming an officer. That's never going to happen. But what I found is the ex-military members tended to be better cops.
Absolutely. I concur with that based off my interviews with my friends in the bomb squad. So Darrin's a very busy guy. We'll hit on a few more things because I don't want to keep him longer. He's a man of the people. The people want to be with Darrin Porcher. I'm fortunate I even got this time on the calendar, in his calendar, that is, to even get him on the show. He is a man with a lot of different plans. So I'll ask you a couple things about more things about your police career, then we'll parlay into what you alluded to earlier, being an expert that travels around the country. And that is, you spent time, of course, as you alluded to earlier, in the Internal Affairs Bureau as a lieutenant, but also in the personnel division. Now, there's the beauty of these interviews with not just the folks from the specialized units of the NYPD, but also just people who had careers as officers, detectives, or in your case, lieutenant, is there's units in that department that I know exist, but I don't exactly know what they do. So this helps that I have you here, because for the personnel division, it doesn't sound that glamorous, but I might be wrong. What does the personnel division do?
The personnel division is responsible for tracking all members within the department and transferring individuals. So, like you have a person that gets transferred to Brooklyn North. If you have an attrition in Brooklyn South, and we need to fill that attrition, so we need 10 cops in, let's say, the 7-6 precinct. The personnel bureau is who's going to make those adjustments. In addition to that, the personnel bureau is, look at it as HR, human resources, because under the umbrella of the personnel bureau, you have recruitment, and you also have the applicant processing division, as well as the medical division. So, people become cops, they have to go through the medical component. In addition to that, if someone is sick, because the NYPD has unlimited sick, you have to, after a period of time, go see one of the doctors in the or the surgeons within the NYPD's health services or medical division, and they'll make the assessment as to, okay, this person is fit for duty, we can send them back to work. So that's kind of what the personnel division does. And the chief of personnel works very closely with the police commissioner, because they want to ensure that the attrition is being filled appropriately, and we have the appropriate level of staffing in certain in units throughout the NYPD to ensure that mission accomplishment is sound.
You spent the last few years of your career working with community affairs, or dealing in community affairs, I should say. And that's a very important thing now. You always hear, especially when Jim O'Neill was commissioner, I can't tell you how many times, not that I'm bashing him, because he's a nice guy, he's been on the show before, that he would talk about community policing. He put a tremendous emphasis on that for you, working in these communities where sometimes there's a disconnect between their police precinct and their community. There's different feelings on both sides of the aisle. What was key for you in making sure that disconnect didn't exist? And if it did exist, properly shoring it up and mending fences?
There's always been a disconnect between police and community, and there should be a symbiotic relationship. And I kind of blame a lot of the executives in the NYPD, because in many instances, the executives didn't lend the proper deference to the Community Affairs Bureau to afford them the necessary resources to continue sustaining that relationship between police and community. The community affairs officers, I think that they do a good job, but they're grossly under-resourced, and I don't think that they have the tools that are appropriate, or I should say enough tools in their arsenal to effectively execute on that police-community relationship and continue it moving forward. A lot of times things will happen, and you'll have a community affairs officer is trying to get information, but the community affairs officer is oftentimes being restricted by the police commander, because that individual may be sent on a detail, or the police commander has a different agenda. And in that way, in many ways, it stifles the communication between the community affairs officer and the members of the public. Another thing, the department, meaning the NYPD, is really big on quantitating things. Okay, what's the number of personal interactions you had? Things that, but with community affairs, it's not quantitative, it should be qualitative, meaning how sound was your interaction with these individuals. And it's difficult to develop a barometer for qualitative engagements, but this is something that you have to be patient with. I think a lot of times with the executives in the NYPD or all police departments, they focus on the interaction between the community affairs officers and the person that's of prominence, meaning the community leader in these particular communities. The community leader always has a voice. So although you should have that discourse, that continued discourse between the the community affairs officer and the community leader, you have that disenfranchised population, which is the 12 or 15-year-old that just comes out and plays basketball or just hangs out on the corner. Many times that disenfranchised population doesn't have a voice. The community affairs officer does not have that level of a relationship with those people. And I think that's essential, that you have that relationship. And I found that many of the executives in the police department didn't recognize nor identify that disenfranchised population needs to have a more robust communication system in play. And because no one is looking at it, what happens is that disenfranchised population tends to do things that may be antisocial, and then it manifests in an aspect of criminal behavior, and that's when you're trying to come in. But you close the gate after the horse has escaped. You need to be more proactive and manage those police and community relationships. And I just don't think that they've gotten it over the course of time. I worked in the Community Affairs Bureau as a lieutenant. I was the integrity control officer. So what I did was I managed a contingent of sergeants, police officers, detectives that were a part of the Community Affairs Bureau. And I thought that you had a lot of guys that were doing good work, but the direction that the department allowed them to move in was somewhat limited. And that's why we have a lot of the police and community disenfranchisement that has been manifested in directions of riots, disturbances, and things to that effect. I mean, case in point, right now, living in New York, you see a million people riding around on bicycles, motorbikes, driving around with these paper plates, and you need to draw more people in that can help you to reduce that problem. I think that the people riding bikes like morons on the sidewalk and riding without helmets on the sidewalks, going in the opposite direction of traffic, something needs to be done. But you're not allowing the community affairs officers to effectively get to that population and get the message out.
And that's true. And it kind of plays out kind of in this time of, as you said, the disconnect. And not only the disconnect, but the disdain. Because when it parlays itself into disdain from one party to the other, well, then nothing, whatever chance you had of getting anything done just disappears out the window. You left in 2011. There's always that moment when, unless you suffer an injury or things like that, there's always that moment if you're able to leave on your own terms where you kind of know, yeah, it's time to go. What was that? Yeah, it's time to call it a day moment for you.
Well, I was working on my doctorate at Fordham University, and I'd finished the coursework. So I was writing this thing called a dissertation. After, once you finish up a doctoral program, you after you finish up the coursework, you have to write this dissertation, which is a couple hundred pages. And it was just very difficult for me to manage the practitioner's perspective of being a lieutenant in the NYPD and write this dissertation. And I was also a single parent at the time. So when you triangulate those three angles, it's very difficult. So you want to go to the weakest link, and the weakest link to me was dropping the police department, writing the dissertation, and continuing through the course of the single parenthood. And that's why I left the NYPD. And I wasn't, a lot of times I hear people say that, hey, do you miss it? Not a day has passed where I missed being a member of the NYPD, because what I did was, I recreated myself after leaving the department. Like I said, I do the expert work all over the country. I'm a professor, and I do a lot of television, so, I mean, I speak on television quite frequently as an expert in connection with whether it was a riot, there was a police shooting, there was a mass shooting, serial killers, things to that effect. I speak to that stuff, and that's kind of what has placed me in a position that I'm in now, more so than when I was a member of the NYPD under the Civil Service Agency.
In talking about going around the country as you have, just recently to Chicago, there's the great mysticism with the NYPD that police departments around the country or even around the world look at them with. You go to Chicago, you go to LA, or even small town police departments, and when somebody says, wow, that guy or that gal was with the NYPD, they go, wow, there's extra attention paid. So for you, in interacting with these individuals from other departments who took the same oath you did, what's the most rewarding thing about that, and what have been some of the more notable experiences?
The most rewarding thing is the pay. You go, once you testify in these criminal trials or these civil trials, that helps, But now, on a serious note, what's the most rewarding thing? It falls into different silos, and it's dependent upon the interaction. So, like case in point, the thing that I just did in Chicago, there was it was a very comprehensive group of people that I was a part of. So group that I was a part of, I should say, district attorneys, corporation counsel attorneys, detectives, police officers that worked within the Chicago Police Department. And there were things that many of those people did better than I did. And there were things that I did better than they did. So it was a collaborative approach. And like just case in point, I remember sitting down with there was a female detective, and I was looking how she conducted interviews. And in my mind, I always thought that I was like really good at doing interviews. Like I could sit down and interview with someone and I could just run the table. But when I saw the way she committed to conducting interviews, I was really impressed. And I was like, wow, man, this is something I've never seen before. It was an aberration, but it was a fruitful aberration that worked. And so, I cherry picked what I could from what she did. And then there was another time I had a case up in, what is this place? In Texas. I actually lived in Texas years ago, but I had a case down in, not Texas, forgive me, I'm sorry, San Diego. The San Diego Police Department hired me for a case there, and one of the attorneys I was working with, one of the attorneys that I was working with was actually a police officer at one point, and we're going over something, and just like in terms of piecing together just a reconstruction of a crime scene, so to speak. And I had my way of doing things, and it was always successful. But what I learned from her was always leave the door open for other options, because she showed me a more fruitful way in reconstructing these crime scenes. And it worked because I use other people for things. I'm not that person that just says, look, you know what, I'll get it done autonomous because I'm the real deal. No, if you can contribute something that can plausibly help, by all means, I'll sit you down at the table and we'll work together. And because I've always been open-minded, I sat down with this district attorney in in San Diego, and once I was able to amass a tremendously different way on how to reconstruct these crime scenes that worked. And it was time efficient too. Like it didn't take as long as it would have normally taken me to do this stuff. So it just, while you go to different places, you try to pick up as much as you can and store that in your toolbox. So when you're in a situation when you need to deploy your armaments, you're 100%, because it's not just coming from the NYPD, it's coming from other places. Although people may be enamored by it, there are always good techniques that you can retrieve from other departments. And I just gave you two. I gave you Chicago and San Diego, but there's a host of other departments that I have gotten information from that have worked for me.
I thank you for your time. That brings us now to the concluding segment of the show. The hour's flown by. It's been a great conversation. I appreciate you being here. It's called Rapid Fire. 5 hit and run questions from me, 5 answers from you. Are you ready? First, most uplifting job that you ever responded to.
The most uplifting job? It's kind of weird that I say this, right? Years ago, we had, and this may sound crazy, this is a time we had hubcaps on police cars. We had a vagrant that was coming to the command and stealing the hubcaps from the police vehicles on the midnight tour. And you say to yourself, what balls of this guy to go to a police precinct and steal the hubcaps over the police cars, right? So the commanding officer said he sent other people out there to try to catch this guy. They laid, no one was able to catch this guy. I went out there one night, I sat back and I caught this guy. So that was probably one of the most uplifting. And this is really this is a low level arrest. Don't get me wrong, but it was just like, I think that was probably a very uplifting point within my career. I mean, I didn't get a medal for this. It wasn't like I saved someone that was being injured. It was just, it was something that I felt good about, because it seemed as if this was a personal attack on us in that particular precinct.
Second, if not for the NYPD, what career could you have seen yourself pursuing?
I worked in the United Nations, and I never mentioned this. Prior to becoming a cop, right, when I came out of the military, I worked at the United Nations for a year, and then I became a cop. And at first I was like, man, this desk job is just, it was a real challenge. But looking back at it, it wouldn't have been a bad thing to make a career out of. I want to make significantly more money, to say the least. But in addition to that, there were a lot more avenues for career progression at the United Nations than I had when I was in the military or when I was a cop. So I could have seen that as what I would have probably done. Continue to do.
Oh, sorry about that. Third best advice, I should say, anyone ever gave you.
The best advice that someone has ever given me. My old lady telling me not to cheat on her, she'll cut my head off. No. The best advice that someone has given me. The best, and I alluded to this earlier. The best advice that I think I've ever been given is every day you're going to be in a fight with your competition. Your competition is in the mirror. When you make yourself the competition, that'll make you a better person, not the people that are around you, because you can always find people that you're better than, and you can always find people that you're worse than. But when you look in the mirror, that's when you really have to dig deep to get it done.
Fourth favorite bar or restaurant in New York City?
Oh, man. Well, I don't drink anymore, but restaurants, wow, I'm a foodie. I mean, last night we went to a restaurant, Il Molino, downtown in Manhattan. I like Il Molino. I like Philippe's, Philippe Chow. I like, there's just so many places that I like. I like the Chart House in Weehawken, New Jersey. I'm a big seafood guy because I don't eat red meat. But I can tell you some tremendous places overseas that you want to get some really good truffle pasta over in Rome. I got a place that I can send you to, but here, here in New York, I want to say it was probably Il Molino, Philippe Chow, and the Chart House in Weehawken, New Jersey.
Fifth and finally, what advice would you give anyone coming on the job now?
Anyone becoming a cop now, I would highly suggest you to be open-minded. You're going to have factions of negativity to surround you in connection with media, in that you'll see cops getting spit on at these demonstrations. You'll have other people that are police officers that'll tell you this is the worst job going. You have friends and family that'll say, why do you want to become a cop? But the truth of the matter, or the standing order, is you have to do what you're most comfortable doing. And this can be a wonderful career to be a part of if you put your all into it. Anything that you do in life, if you put the minimum into it, you'll get the minimum. If you put the maximum into it, you'll get the maximum. And policing is no different. You can rise to the rank of police commissioner, or you can stay in a position that's nominal in the department that doesn't satisfy you nor the individuals around you. So do the best that you, and it's not this be all you can be Army commercial, but the more that you put into it, the more it manifests on the back end. And I highly encourage any and everyone that elects to become a member of a police department to focus on that philosophy.
We first crossed paths on Police Off the Cuff After Hours with Mark DeMeo. We cross paths again now on my show, Mike to New Haven. This was a lot of fun. Before we go, any shout outs you want to give?
I'm just glad that I was on the show. I was fortunate that Mike and I have met one another. I think we had a great discourse on today's show. Hopefully I can come back at another point, and I salute you and continue doing what you're doing, because your words matter.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. On my end, of course, my shout out, as always, is to the viewers. Thank you. If I didn't see you in the chat, if you listened, I appreciate it. And one more shout out to the chat before we go. Margaret Hearn, Ruth Ann Griffin, The Truth, of course, Maui Swift, Boxing MMA 365, and my sister. Thank you guys for your support for the show. As always, coming up next in the Mike to New Haven podcast tomorrow night at 6. If you missed this show, you're going to be kicking yourself that you did. Bob Starkman, retired U.S. Customs agent, and an author, will be here. He's a returning guest, but he's bringing friends. One of the most decorated detectives in the history of the NYPD, Ralph Friedman, will be here. And what's better, Joe Pistone, the real Donnie Brasco, is going to be on the show as well. This is a panel called Behind the Badges with Starkman, Pistone, and Friedman. Don't miss it. Live tomorrow, Tuesday night, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Be there or be square. In the meantime, on behalf of retired NYPD Lieutenant Darrin Porcher, I'm Mike Colón. Darrin, don't sign off yet. We'll do a debrief off the air, and we will see you next time. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.